Welcome, online viewers. This is the 8th in a series of 12 lectures on the 50 years that changed painting. I'd like to thank Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly for sponsoring the series and its transfer online, and the Drill Hall Gallery at the Australian National University for hosting this series. 1910, a great year in the 50 years that changed painting, foremost because of the condition of greater visibility, the new art coming on the scene, and the not-so-new art, which was nonetheless being experienced for the first time, became known to a large public, and more than that, became a burgeoning international phenomenon. The exhibition Manet and the Post-Impressionists, otherwise known as the first Post-Impressionist exhibition, organized by Roger Fry and Desmond McCarthy in 1910 for the Grafton Galleries in London, took place over 2 months and attracted more than 25,000 visitors. It stirred up a furor of controversy. The scandalized reception of the exhibition is worth careful study, yet it wasn't by any means an isolated case. The majority of people who saw the new art were evidently appalled by it. It was seen as a descent into madness, a barbarian incursion, as an eruption of sexual degeneracy. Roger Fry, up till that time, had maintained a distinguished career as a museum director, an art historian, an outstanding lecturer and writer, but his newly assumed role as impresario, interpreter, and historian of modern art utterly destroyed his respectability and credibility in the eyes of the majority. Not to be deterred, however, Fry organized a follow-up exhibition 2 years later, where Matisse was represented in strength, as you can infer from Vanessa Bell's little painting. Matisse was shown much more cogently the second time around than in the first post-impressionist exhibition. These 2 shows racked up a whole lot of firsts, in fact. They put Cézanne on the map for the English-speaking world. Fry's advocacy of Cézanne proved absolutely crucial, as John Revolt was at pains to spell out in an extensive tribute to Fry he incorporated into Cézanne's catalogue raisonné, where he declared, "Cézanne's posthumous fate and rise to glory is inseparably linked to Fry's actions, lectures, and writings on his behalf. No study of the painter's work would be complete without acknowledging Fry's important and pioneering role." This is unassailably true. Earlier in 1910, in February, Roger Fry's translation into English of Maurice Denis' famous essay on Cézanne appeared in the Burlington magazine, where it would have given the first inkling to many of his readers that there was an important French artist whose name was Cézanne. Fry's shows were also the first in the English-speaking world to present Matisse's and Picasso's work, and to do so in sufficient quantity and at the requisite level of quality to instate them, or to suggest to the viewing public, that these were special talents, that their works might be considered a cut above the rest. There were 20 paintings by Cézanne in Manet and the Post-Impressionists, and these are two that were on show. The woman with the rosary on the left was probably the closest a Cézanne painting ever came to looking like an old master painting, like a Rembrandt. And for that reason, it seems, it became the most famous, most reproduced work in those early years. And it was an emblematic exhibit, not only in Fry's first post-impressionist exhibition in London, but also in the Armory Show, which opened in New York 2 years later and toured to Philadelphia and Boston. On the left, a poster for the Armory Show. On the right, the catalogue for the first Autumn Salon, Die erste Deutsches Herbstsalon, held in Berlin in 1913. And the photo below is of the notorious Cubist room in the Salon d'Automne in Paris in 1912, all of these being landmark events in the history of modern art, all of them furiously execrated by the majority of viewers and lambasted by critics in the most colourful terms. You'll notice that the Armory Show was presented as an international exhibition of modern art, and there you have the term applied to a category, a phenomenon, and most strikingly of all, to a lineage, to a purported tradition of the new. Ingres and Delacroix head the list of artists, presumed to be precursors of the movements that followed Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, and also the first abstract paintings ever to be shown to a large public, which were a feature of these three exhibitions. I've made the point before, but I need to make it again. At the turn of the century, in the eyes of the general public, the most famous, most admired, most expensive artists had names like Sir Frederick Leighton, Sir Edward Burne-Jones, Sir Edward Poynter, Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema. They were academicians who had been recognized by the Queen and given knighthoods. Or in France, they had names like Jean-Léon Gérôme, Jean-Louis Ernest Meissonier, Edouard de Taille, who we see on the screen, William Adolphe Bouguereau, Alexandre Cabanal, Jean-Paul Laurens, Rosa Bonnard, all of them academicians who had been awarded the Legion of Honor, some of them multiple times. Modern art, as it was now constituted, presupposed the total destitution of the Academy and the bankruptcy of its traditions. The fact that few, if any of you, will have recognized names in the roll of honor I've just called out is the consequence of the ascendancy of modernism and its obliteration of academicism, even as a memory. What made the paintings of Gauguin, Seurat, Van Gogh so offensive was that basically they weren't at all like this. On the screen, Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema's Egyptian-themed blockbuster, The Finding of Moses. And here it's juxtaposed with Matisse's Luxe, Calme et Volupté, luxury, calm, and voluptuousness, Matisse's title comes from the poem by Baudelaire. Both pictures were painted in 1904. Matisse's work was shown in the Salon des Indépendants in Paris in 1905, where its substantial size, aggressive chromaticism, and strangely drawn nudes attracted attention but didn't win much sympathy or admiration. Michael Polanyi, who I mentioned in the last lecture, someone with a very wise head, lived through some of the controversies and reversals of taste which are characteristic of modern times, and what he had to say on the subject is worth hearing. We are shocked by the offer of an unfamiliar system purporting to be meaningful. When the public is pressed to enter the new framework so as to discover its meaning, their bewilderment turns into indignation. They are outraged at the respect paid to what seems to them deserving of contempt, and angry at the implied contempt for their own standards of excellence. In such conflicts, the two sides are actually fighting for their lives, or at least part of their lives. For in the existence of each, there is an area which can be kept in being only by denying reality to an area in the existence of the other. The two sides are actually fighting for their lives. In 1905, 5 years before the first post-impressionist exhibition took place, Roger Fry put forward his views on academicism very forthrightly. But as yet, as you will infer from his remarks, his understanding and his appreciation of the achievements of the non-academic and anti-academic figureheads in 19th century French painting was surprisingly limited and patchy. Here is what he wrote. Tradition may degenerate into complete sterility, for the laws of artistic expression differ from those of science. Their value is not fixed once and for all. It depends upon the ardor and force of conviction with which they are accepted. For want of this, a complete bankruptcy of tradition was reached in the first half of the 19th century, and the subsequent history of art has been the story not of a gradual process of construction, but of successive revolutions, each illuminated by one or more heroic figures, and each ending without establishing more than a provisional government. The greater art of the period has been an art of revolt, and it bears the trace of its origins in its extravagant individualism, its feverish and quickly exhausted energy, its waste of power in fruitless experiment, and its small actual accomplishment. We've tried, in fact, every alternative, denied, in turn, every principle that governed the art of the past, and nearly always the genuine artist has been among the iconoclasts. I've quoted this text at length because in it we catch Fry at such an exciting moment, on the threshold of a great intellectual adventure. But note well, this text still represents an outsider's point of view. And the rebel artists he vaguely evokes were his readers in 1905, supposed to know who they were, are equated with iconoclasts, literally people who smash images. And their achievements are ascribed to, or they're implied to stem from, vaguely defined impulses of nihilism and negativity. The artists in question abandon aesthetic principles, they flout convention, but in the long run, their transgressions make little difference. What they achieve are flashes in the pan. Fry characterizes them as discontinuous moments, inconsequential, wasteful, fruitless, quite pitiable, in fact. In 1905, Fry still takes on the position of a detached observer, a non-partisan, an outsider. However, there is a telling phrase in this text which suggests that this wasn't entirely the case. It's where the words ardor and force of conviction occur. What he was proposing here is that the rating and ranking of art and artists corresponds, or should correspond, to those criteria, ardor and force of conviction. Not only laypersons, but most of the art historians I know would be too baffled and embarrassed to accept these as criteria of judgment. But Fry was much more of an insider than he let on. He had an artistic training. He even attended art school in Paris, the Académie Julian, in 1892, a year when Matisse was a student there too, although their paths didn't cross. Having intuitive understanding of an artist's motivation, the ability to detect sincerity, dedication, intelligence, integrity of purpose, and force of character in a painting is, of course, profoundly subjective, and some might say presumptuous, but it's the prerogative of someone who knows art from the inside. Let's look again at that sentence. The value of the laws of artistic expression is not fixed once and for all. It depends on the ardor and force of conviction with which they are accepted. But accepted by whom? By the artists themselves, by an educated public, by connoisseurs, by the culture in general. Because of his dawning appreciation, ardor, and force of conviction in the excellence of the rebel artists, Fry became not only their advocate and promoter, he became a force for change in his own right. In effect, he became a very persuasive tastemaker. The schismatic camps of early 20th century visual culture were now locked in a pitch battle for survival, with both fighting for their lives. In the year after Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema died, the Royal Academy mounted a huge memorial exhibition in his honor, which was rapturously received by a huge public and acclaimed by the majority of critics in the press. and Fry was moved to write a scathing attack on it. The word kitsch doesn't seem to have featured in Fry's vocabulary, but the battle lines were by then clearly drawn between kitsch and the avant-garde. I quote, Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema is only an extreme instance of the commercial materialism of our civilization. Against that, the artist is and must always be in revolt. Those were Fry's fighting words. Both of Fry's post-impressionist exhibitions sought to correct the mistaken idea he had propagated that the independent proto-modern art of the 19th century had appeared in flashes, that there was no continuity, consistency, or consequence in its manifestations. Obvious to us now, this was a mistake which only a rank outsider could make. Cézanne, Whistler, Matisse, Picasso, and virtually all of the non-academic and anti-academic painters we know of would have been perfectly cognizant of the history or of the histories of the tradition or of the traditions which informed their practice. Fry's characterization of the flashpoints in 19th century art as being unconnected, inconsequential, dead ends was untenable, of course, but he made amends for this in his two post-impressionist exhibitions, which intended to demonstrate consistency and continuities between three generations of painters. This painting is called La Desserte, painted in 1896 to 1897, when Matisse was 29 years old. I apologize for the poor quality of the reproduction, the richness of color, the translucent burgundy reds and pale yellows in the wine decanters, the sheen of the green apples, the glow of the oranges. You'll have to imagine they're there. However, you do get a sense of effervescent light and the sumptuousness of this great set piece in which the young Matisse is demonstrating everything he's learnt as a student at the École des Beaux-Arts, as the student of Gustave Moreau during the previous 5 years. His deviation, that's how it was considered, into naturalism, into la peinture claire, light-toned paintings, which was another name for Impressionism, was thought to be a most regrettable lapse, according to his professors. Matisse, like all of his contemporaries who were moved by an ethos that we call modernism, methodically worked his way through a sequence of idioms. There was an academic foundation, there was a deviation into realism and naturalism, there was the espousal of Impressionism, then there was an engagement with Neo-Impressionism and with some aspects of symbolism. For me, the most striking, the most significant phase that Matisse and many of his contemporaries went through, not just Matisse, but also Kandinsky, Mondrian, Picasso, Derain, all of them, was their engagement with a Nabi idiom. They passed through the Nabi watershed. This isn't what we're taught in the standard art histories, of course, but that's where we might locate a fundamental paradigm shift in theory and in practice as it relates to the Nabi's conception of visual metaphor. Up until this point, the conception of art was more or less exclusively based on the imitation of appearances, what the ancient Greeks called mimesis and what Matisse called empiricism, that is to say, the imitation of appearances. But prompted by the examples of Gauguin and Cézanne, and for other reasons and circumstances that we have examined in lecture number 6, the Nabis sought to overturn, or at least to rattle, the empirical basis of art. On the screen, a painting by Matisse from 1898, which might fit in perfectly well with how Vuillard and Bonnard were painting at the same time. The debates going on about when a painting was finished, when a visual statement was complete, were already leaving their mark on Matisse. And here again, from a year later. Between 1895 and 1909, Maurice Denis published a series of essays wherein he developed his theory of visual metaphor. Just to clarify, that is very much within the Nabi, the context of the Nabi group. What is a metaphor? The poet Ezra Pound gave the best definition of it. He said, a metaphor is a resembling unlikeness. It is unlike, yet it resembles. In Maurice Denis' parlance, a metaphor was an equivalence, and that is the term Matisse used again and again to justify his amazing adventures in visual poetry, exploiting the realm of resembling unlikeness. In 1895, in the catalogue for the 9th exhibition of Impressionist and Symbolist painters, Maurice Denis wrote that the exhibiting artists, quote, prefer expression by means of decor, through the shapes and colors and through the materials employed, than by means of the subject. They believe that for every emotion, for every human thought, there is a plastic equivalent, decorative, a corresponding beauty. Those words, decor and decorative, may sound a little strange to our ears, but decor means totalizing, unifying the indivisibility of the ensemble, and decorative means stylized, flat, surface affirming, as in the case of a pattern, but it is also a synonym for abstract. And decor and decorative are words Maurice Denis associates with synthetic and synthesis, which became the key terms in the way Matisse rationalized his own art. Every work of art is a transposition, a caricature, the passionate equivalent of a sensation received. Maurice Denis wrote that in 1903. These are the characteristics of visual metaphors, of plastic equivalences. They are transpositions, caricatures, passionate equivalents of sensations received. How awe-inspiring this declaration, if you consider the art that followed: Fauvism, Cubism, Expressionism, Futurism, etc., etc. These are two paintings by André Derain, Matisse's co-conspirator in Fauvism. Derain did them in 1904, one in the vicinity of Chatou, the other at Bougival. Both Derain and his close friend Maurice de Vlaminck at this time revisited the old stamping grounds of Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, and Sisley, rediscovering the so-called cradle of Impressionism. And these paintings by Derain, too, could fit in quite seamlessly in any show of Nabi paintings. I'll leave them on the screen so that Maurice Denis' words can resonate and you can appreciate their profound implications. The theory of equivalence, Maurice Denis wrote, provided us, in the Nabi group, with our means. We availed ourselves of its expressive imagery. It gave us the right to lyricism. For example, if it was permitted to paint in vermilion a tree that at the moment looked very russet to us, why not translate other things in a plastic manner, exaggerating the impressions that justify the poet's metaphors? Why not assert to the point of deformation the curve of a beautiful shoulder, exaggerate the pearly whiteness of a carnation, stiffen the branches that no wind stirred? Why not assert to the point of deformation the curve of a beautiful shoulder? Denis' theory of equivalence, of visual metaphor, gives license to creative distortion, and thereby implicitly establishes a continuity with the art criticism of Baudelaire, because, according to Baudelaire, the three great draftsmen of his time were Ingres, Delacroix, and Daumier, all of them notorious distorters, whereas Maurice Denis' trio of exemplary precursors, the founding fathers of post-impressionism, Cézanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh, were likewise incorrigible distorters. So why not exaggerate a curve to the point of deformation? In this wonderful sketchbook drawing by Cézanne, he seizes on the fantastic liberties taken by Delacroix in creatively reorganizing human anatomy and deriving from it an arabesque, an artificial construct. The arabesque, enthusiastically embraced by the Nabis, became the very DNA of Matisse's approach to figuration, and simultaneously to his approach to abstraction. Why are you infatuated with the arabesque? An interviewer, André Verdet, asked Matisse. Because it is the most synthetic means of expression, Matisse replied. You find it in the long lines of the drawings on cave walls. It's the impulse, the élan of passion that swells those drawings. The arabesque is organized, or it organizes itself, like music. Matisse was a truly great sculptor as well as a great painter and draftsman, and here you see him reproportioning bodies, rearranging their architecture, lopping off hands or entire limbs, any detail extraneous to the coherence of the ensemble, just as he would do in many of his paintings. All of this language we've been hearing, decor, decoration, distortion, deformation, metaphor, equivalence, lyricism, music. This is a language that continually resonates in relation to Matisse's body of work. The arabesque that he could trace through Cézanne to Delacroix, from Delacroix and Ingres to Rubens and Raphael, all the way back to the cave painters of Lascaux and Altamira, remembering as well the Japanese woodblock printmakers and the Islamic art that he rapturously discovered in 1903 in a great exhibition held in the Pavillon Marsan in Paris, and by the advent of Diaghilev's Russian Ballet Company in Paris, with its extravagantly colorful productions and billowing costumes and unfamiliarly strident, increasingly dissonant new music. It was the ubiquity and universality of the arabesque that linked Matisse's art to all of these very diverse phenomena. Artists' disaffiliation from naturalism or from empiricism, as Matisse put it, and their espousal of a radically metaphorical approach to representation made them receptive for the first time to the sculptures and artifacts which at the time were at best ethnographic curiosities from Africa and Oceania. Matisse, along with other artists associated with Fauvism, Vlaminck and Derain, and subsequently Braque and Picasso and the German Expressionists, became the leading edge of a growing appreciation of African art. For the concentrated intensity, the inventiveness, and the artistry of those unaccounted and unaccountable exotic artifacts. Art, instead of being a copy of nature, becomes the subjective deformation of nature. That was Maurice Denis' aphorism, and it anticipates the great paradigm shift that ushered in what we're now seeing on the screen. The outsider's view of the rebel artists of previous generations, the notion that their efforts were uncoordinated, inconsequential dead ends, was not at all the insider's view, as we've said, insiders being conscious of continuities and consistencies. Because of the oppressive hegemony of academic art, it became the responsibility of insiders to articulate their opposing notions of tradition and history, of promoting their pantheon of venerated forerunners and their prioritization of the ideas and the issues that mattered to them. Their very survival, their relevance to posterity, not to mention their comprehensibility in the eyes of their contemporaries, depended on ardor and force of conviction. Roger Fry was quite right about that, but it also required putting one's ardor and force of conviction into words, publishing one's thoughts. Ultimately, Roger Fry espoused an insider's perspective in his accounts of post-impressionism. Maurice Denis, likewise, wrote as an insider. Matisse became an exemplary explainer too. His writings and interviews are indispensable. Another insider figure of central importance was Paul Signac. On the screen is a painting by Paul Signac representing Félix Fénéon. Both Signac and Fénéon played key roles in Matisse's ascendancy, and Fénéon and Signac, both of them, were prototypes of what later came to be recognized as engaged modernists, taking on their roles 20-25 years before Roger Fry or Alfred Stieglitz or Guillaume Apollinaire, or the dozens of others who came on the scene considerably later. The outstanding qualities of Fénéon and Signac, as with Fry, were their intellectual acumen, as well as their actions and activism, their mentorship and propagation of modern art. First of all, Fénéon began publishing art criticism at the tender age of 22 in 1883, a review of the National Exhibition of Fine Arts, in which he poked fun at the ubiquity of pompous, pretentious subject paintings, and scorned some of its stars like Meissonier, and attacked the hegemony of the Academy. Fénéon repeatedly protested against the stranglehold of official vetting and called out for an autonomous art, independent of official sanction. An up-and-coming man of letters, Fénéon was a regular attendee of the famous Mardi, the Tuesday soirées held in the apartment of the poet Stéphane Mallarmé, where the cream of contemporary literary society rubbed shoulders with visual artists such as Monet, Degas, Vuillard, Rodin, who were among the regulars. Fénéon was the co-editor with Gustave Kahn of Arthur Rimbaud's great prose poem, Les Illuminations, a landmark of modern poetry. The edition came out in 1886. Les Illuminations was Rimbaud's last work. He gave up writing poetry at the age of 20. The vitality and originality of Les Illuminations, which can amaze people to this very day, stems from an effort, a successful effort, to harness the irrational, to engage the subconscious, to unleash intuitive, instinctive powers of the imagination. As Rimbaud claimed, the poet ought to be a visionary, a seer. Quote, the poet makes himself a seer by a long, prodigious, and reasoned disordering of all the senses. And through this, the poet reaches the unknown. In the same year that Les Illuminations came out, Félix Fénéon visited the 8th and last of the historic Impressionist exhibitions, which made a tremendous impact on him. This was the exhibition that launched a new generation of artists, foremost among them Georges Seurat, who showed an enormous canvas, a very complex, very formal, strangely stilted set piece, entirely painted in little points of unblended colour. Seurat was only 25 years old, and his sidekick and best friend, Paul Signac, who was also exhibiting, was 21 years old. Fénéon established close ties of friendship with them both. The technique that Seurat, Signac, and other painters of their circle shared was called by several names: pointillism, divisionism, and Neo-Impressionism. It was based on the principle that small points of pure colour will blend energetically in the mind's eye, producing optical mixtures. Only the colours of the prism could be used, with admixtures of white wherever required. To decompose solar light into its rays, into its elements, and to recompose its unity through the general harmony of the iridescences that they spread over their canvases. Strange to say, this was the critic Edmond Duranty's notion of Impressionism, articulated long before Seurat had developed his methodology. Nonetheless, the Neo-Impressionists acknowledged their affiliation and their indebtedness to the pioneering Impressionists. Their great hope was that they could go one better, that they could generate impressions of light which were more brilliant, more intense, and they could also compose their pictures more deliberately and less haphazardly, being less tethered to the fleeting moment, less tethered to empiricism, and also, in addition, their methodology was related to the science of optics. Signac depicts Félix Fénéon against a bizarre, eruptive background, looking like a carnival barker or a ringmaster. As in real life, Fénéon was a character. His crew cut and goatee beard were affectations to make him look like an American, like Uncle Sam, or like a Quaker. Rémy de Gourmont said of him, he gives himself the air of an American Mephistopheles. There's a sort of trope on the stars and stripes that Signac has placed behind him. Is this pinwheel of rotating, clashing patterns a symbol for the exhilarating prospect of an unknowable future, with Fénelon, an impresario, an arbiter, ready to announce its advent. A recent exhibition I saw in Paris, curated by Isabelle Kahn and Philippe Peltier, which was devoted to Fénelon, unearthed not only Signac's study for the background of the picture, but something like its probable source, a design for motifs for kimono textiles. In 1898, over several installments published in La Revue Blanche, where Félix Fénelon was the editor, Paul Signac published a hugely influential text, which was his attempt at restitution, written from the point of view of an insider in art, of currents that had led from the time of Eugène Delacroix through the Naturalists and Impressionists through to his own generation of artists, and which had placed greater and greater emphasis on the autonomy of colour. This was the tradition, this was the evolution, this was the logic of history that Signac was able to discern, moved by his ardour and force of conviction. The articles were gathered together into a book, published the following year in 1899, and there were translations of this text in virtually every European language. Printed on the flyleaf of the book was a dedication to the memory of his friend Georges Seurat, who had died in 1891, aged 31. And at the end, more resoundingly, there was a second dedication to the painters of the future, or the one painter who would sweep all before him. 19th century people in France, as elsewhere, were not so careful about their pronouns. So I'd like to think that Signac's use of he and him didn't exclude the possibility that the painter he was referring to could possibly be a woman, but let's try to hear Signac out in good faith. The triumphant colourist has only to appear. His palette has been prepared for him. Imagine how many artists would have read this exhortation, and there were hundreds and thousands of them, and the effect it would have had. The imaginary palette Signac brandished before his readers had been prepared by successive generations, yet it required considerable reserves of courage to seize the spirit of liberty presupposed by Signac's rhetoric and bring to fruition an art of autonomous colour, the likes of which the world had never seen before. One can barely conceive how this incitement would have opened the floodgates, resulting in a superabundance of ostentatious colourists crowding onto the scene, and how the ensuing superabundance, the excess of colour in the Salon des Indépendants and the Salon d'Automne in the following years might have provoked a reaction against it with the advent of Cubism and the so-called return to order and a new austerity. There's a striking passage in the text where Signac distinguished between the characteristic touch of Impressionist and Neo-Impressionist paintings, claiming that the Neo-Impressionist dot was fundamentally non-representational, that it was, in effect, a completely abstract entity. And I quote, "The comma-shaped touch of the Impressionists in some cases plays the same expressive role as Delacroix's hatching does, for example, when it imitates the form of an object, a leaf or a wave, a blade of grass. But at other times, it operates like the divided touch of the Neo-Impressionists. All that it represents are colored elements, separate and juxtaposed, reconstitutable by optical mixture. The role of these touches can be explained simply in terms of the need to adorn surfaces by multiplying colored elements without any care to copy nature." Here are two small, incredibly daring experimental paintings by Matisse, Fauvism at its most radical and revolutionary, which appear to have acted upon Signac's description, taking it as a directive. But here are Matisse's own words. "For me, the subject of a picture and the background have the same value. Or to put it more clearly, there's no principal feature. Only the pattern is important. In the same way that in a musical harmony, each note is part of the whole, so I wished each color to have a contributory role." Matisse wrote that in 1935, but here in 1905, in these small, most daringly experimental paintings, he's implementing the idea in no uncertain terms. For Matisse, Derain, and Robert Delaunay, and for others for whom Neo-Impressionism was a formative experience, even for those who didn't stay with it long or merely dabbled with it, all of them realized that such atomized abstract units of color provided a way of breaking down pictorial hierarchies, weaving together foreground and background, figure and ground, solid and void, and instigating a radically novel approach to pictorial composition by means of the free interplay of color, absolved of the responsibility of naturalistic description. By forsaking empiricism and by embracing the concept of visual metaphor, of equivalence, this new painting of the 20th century no longer looked like anything that had come before it. Signac's role in the 50 years that changed painting wasn't just confined to his own painting and writing. He was an activist and a propagator of artistic innovation. As much as anybody, he helped to establish a sustainable basis for the libertarian culture of Paris, to set the tone of open-mindedness and inclusiveness that made the City of Light a lodestar for the free spirits who flocked there from far and wide. Signac was involved in the Salon des Indépendants from its inception in 1884, participating in every one of its exhibitions and functioning as its chairman till his death in 1935. The Salon des Indépendants took place in alternation with the Salon d'Automne, which commenced in 1903. These two libertarian havens supported a thriving counterculture, a counterculture whose ardor and force of conviction finally proved lethal to the old dinosaurs of the French Academy, and by contagion to the British academicians as well. At a crucial moment in Matisse's development, Signac adopted him as a protégé. This would probably have coincided with the time when Signac's articles were appearing in La Revue Blanche. Inviting Matisse to join him in his hometown of Saint-Tropez, Signac recruited Matisse as a budding Neo-Impressionist. You will have gathered, of course, that Matisse's palette of spectral colours relates to the colour wheel. Matisse exhibited looks calme et volupté in the Salon des Indépendants of 1904, and it was bought by Signac, who hung the painting in his dining room. However, Matisse had developed doubts about this painting, and he sent a postcard to Signac asking the question that was plaguing him. Did you find a perfect harmony between the character of the drawing and the character of the painting in my bather's painting? That's to say, looks calme et volupté. To me, they look totally different from one another, totally contrary. Matisse's doubts about the success of this painting in terms of its failed synthesis of drawing and colour led to a phase of intense experimentation across a whole range of media: painting, drawing, watercolour, sculpture, and printmaking. Later in life, Matisse recalled this period of upheaval, acknowledging how much he had learned from it, admitting how greatly he had benefited from the transgressions of his youth. These works, he wrote, connected with his immersion in Neo-Impressionism and Fauvism, led me to study each element of construction separately: drawing, colour, tone, composition, seeking for how these elements could combine in a synthesis without the eloquence of one being diminished by the presence of others, and to construct with those elements undiminished in their intrinsic quality, despite their combination, that is to say, respecting the purity of means. We see the results of this process of separating out and recombining the elements of painting in the works that Matisse and Derain produced during their summer holiday in Collioure in 1905, of course, and in this astonishing painting, presumably painted after Matisse's return to Paris. Interesting to note that Félix Fénéon, steeped in Neo-Impressionism as he was, could readily accept and appreciate its radical wager. He bought this painting from Matisse virtually hot off the easel. And maybe it was Fénion's veneration of Rimbaud and his recognition that the prelude to Matisse's composition would have entailed a dérèglement de tous les sens, a reasoned disordering of the senses, which would have helped Fénion to grasp Matisse's exceptional qualities, if you will, his genius. And after 1906, when Fénion was appointed director of the Bernheim Jeune Gallery, he became Matisse's dealer. In the Salon des Indépendants of 1906, Matisse, Derain, and all the Fauves, including the newcomers, Georges Braque, Autant Frieze, Raoul Dufy, were assembled in a show of strength. The critics singled out Matisse as the ringleader, as the chef d'école, and targeted his large painting, Le Bonheur de Vivre, which is now in the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, for concerted attack. It's a painting which you could say conforms with Maurice Denis' categorization of visual metaphor, the transposition, the caricature, the passionate equivalent of a sensation received. But the sensation received here doesn't come from a source in nature. It is based in culture, in the painting tradition. Matisse's contemporaries who saw this painting in 1906 tended to be very confused in their response, conflicted as to whether what they were seeing was an appalling, almost neon-bright travesty of a traditional pastoral subject, or of something quite apart from that, an autonomous formal creation. Indeed, several critics bandied around the words abstract and abstraction, words they assumed were damning. Wassily Kandinsky, along with his partner Gabriela Munter and their friends Alexei von Yavlensky and Mariana Verefkin, all of them painters, were in Paris in 1906 and were able to see the Salon des Indépendants, as well as a one-man show by Matisse at the Galerie Drouet, which was being held simultaneously. Kandinsky remembered, in 1906, I saw for the first time Matisse's early pictures, which were highly controversial. Much encouraged, I asked myself the question whether one might not simply reduce or distort objects, but do away with them altogether. So I went over to abstract painting by way of Expressionism, Expressionism being at the time a synonym for Fauvism. Matisse's and Derain's bid to disentangle the components of representation, line, color, tone, shape, volume, etc., was an endeavor Kandinsky adopted in turn. In the boldest of his transitional works, as you see on the screen, he brought about a dissociation of line and color and created a deliberate confusion or an effect of indeterminacy or an ingenious interpenetration of figure and ground. The process brings about the quite literal undoing of figurative painting, making figuration more or less impossible, and yet opening up other realms of possibility. This dissociation of the elements of painting, the elements that had been traditionally tied to representation, and their recombination in a new abstract-tending synthesis, was a characteristic feature of much avant-garde painting of the time, and, of course, it was the prerequisite for pure abstraction to emerge. You will find parallel developments of exactly this kind happening simultaneously across a whole range of artists' work. In the prelude to Kupka's and Kandinsky's initial abstract paintings. We have a very real medium, color, Robert Delaunay declared. But despite thousands of years of the art of painting, we are at the beginning in terms of awareness of our craft, which no longer arises from a story to tell, from an object to copy, to reproduce, or deform. We are back with ourselves and our brushes. The fact of painting is, for us, to reveal our consciousness, to become aware of the elements that constitute this act. It is in this way that we learn, like children, the constructive language of color. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks for your interest. See you soon.